Hello and welcome. Today we would be discussing and demoing the Just Enough Administration GIA from Microsoft. And before we actually go into the live demonstration, it's obvious that we need to understand that what this topic is all about, what business or technical challenges we are trying to resolve with the solution. So let's just try to get into, right? So Microsoft have two interesting technologies that go side by side. One is Just Enough Administration, GIA, JEA, which is the today's topic. And then there is a second one, which is called as Just-in-Time Administration, which is referred as JIA, GIA. Obviously, that's not the topic for today. And if you need more information on GIA, JIA, GIA, Just-in-Time Administration, I encourage you to watch my another video on my same YouTube video channel called as a Privilege Access Management, and you will see all the required details on just-in-time administration. Pretty fascinating video in my viewpoint. A lot of people have liked it, so please go, and if you have not watched it already, it would be an interesting watch for you. Now, when we talk about just enough administration, this is a Microsoft PowerShell capability, or if I want to define it in a very layman terminology, it's a secure Microsoft PowerShell operations to manage certain pieces of your system, right? And that is what is the PowerShell brings to you in terms of GIA. We will see what other versions are supported for the GIA component in next slide. But let's try to understand that what is our objective. Many a times we will find that we need to give higher privilege account to administrators to do certain functions on the system. Sometimes you will see a SQL administrator has the full administrative rights on the box, right? A DNS admin needs the full-blown administration rights on the box. I was working for a large automobile manufacturing company, one of the largest in US, and we had to give the domain admin rights on every single plant because they need to manage certain part of that server, right? So that's very risky and scary, because when we give these kind of rights to the people who should not be managing the other component of your system, that brings a huge security threat, and we definitely want to avoid that. In my viewpoint, GIA, Just Enough Administration, does it very effectively, with the only caveat is that it is only related to PowerShell. So the GIA user or GIA operator should be very well conversant about PowerShell command to complete his or her daily task, and that is very important part of it. Not very hard, not very difficult. Going forward, we all will be using more and more PowerShell. We already know it, but that's one of the caveat that we need to understand. Second thing is that we want to limit the user capability. As I said, if you need to manage DNS, then I don't want you to touch my Active Directory. How do we do it effectively? You want to manage Active Directory, I just want to manage you as one component of Active Directory. Say I just want you to be able to unlock users, or I just want you to be able to add users to a particular group. And that is what we accomplished through GIA. And not only that, we should have a better reporting capability. So we should also see, hey, we have allowed this user these particular rights, or a proper RBAC model, role-based access control model, and what is actually happening, what this user is actually doing on your systems, right? So all three very, very important tasks. And when you combine these three together, it obviously avoids the lateral attacks. So the user who's assigned or who is responsible for certain tasks should not be touching and should not be doing other components or other functionality or other features being serviced by the same system, right? And that is all we accomplish through the use of GIA. Once again, I want to reiterate, this is a PowerShell capability, and this feature set is built into Microsoft PowerShell, right? And we'll see in next slide what those prerequisites are. Two use cases that we are going to discuss, or we're going to demo today, we are going to see, and that probably would relate to many of you, because often we run DNS on a domain controller, kind of a best practice, and often the organization wants that DNS should be managed by separate DNS admins, and they should not be able to manage or touch Active Directory, right? That's one scenario. And the second is that we are going to try to manage certain portion of Active Directory, maybe considered like a helpless role through the GIA. These are the two realistic cases, and hope you will find them interesting, right? So one of the very interesting feature of GIA, which makes it, which can make it a darling for your security team, is that while the user is or operator is doing those tasks, he or she is not actually using your Active Directory identities. It can create a temporary virtual ID, right? That's not a regular ID of the user. And as soon as the PowerShell session is done or closed, that ID is gone. So from security perspective, the exposure to the privileged identity is been minimized with this approach. Of course, this is optional, but this is one of the feature set that probably everybody would like to use it, right? So we would use temporary virtual IDs throughout this remote PowerShell session, and as soon as the session is done, that ID is gone, and I'll be able to show you exactly what I'm talking about. With that, let's look into the prerequisites. So very straightforward in my viewpoint. The system or the server that you're trying to manage through GIA, if it is a Windows Server 2016, it's already pre-installed. You don't have to do anything. If it is Windows Server 2012 R2 or Windows Server 2012, you can have the full functionality, but you may have to install the Windows Management Framework 5.1 that upgrades your PowerShell to the PowerShell 5.0 version. And once you do that, you can take the advantage of GIA capabilities. You could also do on Windows 2008 R2 after installing WMF or Windows Management Framework 5.1, but it would have reduced functionality. As far as the client operating system is concerned, which I would call as a operator, GIA operator or GIA user, you have Windows 10 1607 plus build. It is already pre-installed, nothing needs to be done. Windows 10 1603 and 1511 build, it is pre-installed, but it has a reduced functionality. Windows 10 1507, it is not available. Windows 8 and 8.1, we would still need to install the Windows Management Framework 5.1, and then you get the full functionality. And Windows 7 would have the reduced functionality after installing the Windows Management Framework 5.1. Obviously, this is a remote PSing, so remote PowerShell, so we need to enable the PS remoting. And in order to have a better reporting and monitoring, we will need to modify the GPU for PowerShell reporting. Installing an XGIA component is optional, not necessary. This is a latest version of that. And we're going to see the role of GIA Helper Toolkit. Actually, I learned that this name has been changed. This GIA Helper Toolkit was 1.0. The newer version is, I think, called as a GIA Helper Tool or something, right? So its name has changed. So we'll see that momentarily. So that's your prerequisite. I think it's pretty straightforward. Installing Windows Management Framework for all of you should not be a difficult task. Download it, install it, reboot it, and your system is upgraded to PowerShell version 5.0. At a very high level, let's try to see the component of the solution, right? So obviously at the one end, we have a GIA operator, which is using their desktop operating system, supported as I showed in the last slide. And then in my demonstration, I have got a domain controller, which is running Windows Server 2012 R2, which is also running DNS, right? And when we configure the solution, or when we configure GIA, the components are that we would need to create a GIA role capability file, which is generally .psrc file, and that defines the kind of a rollback access model for your users or the group, that what PowerShell command that user can use, right? And we will create that. And then secondly, once we have created this role capability file, then we create a GIA configuration file, which is .pssc file. And once that PSSC file is referring to this GIA role capability file, and once that is done, we register that configuration file, and that actually creates the GIA endpoint where user actually makes the remote PS session, right? Very straightforward. With that, I think we can get into the demo now, and let me try to get into my lab. So folks, this is my Hyper-V server. I got several VMs here, but the two VMs that we are gonna use for today's demo would be one here is AZLGL-DC02, which is my domain controller as I showed in the PowerPoint, and the workstation or the operator machine would be AZAdmin W10, which I think I renamed it. So let's see here, this is my machine. That's a workstation. It's a Windows 10 machine. And then I have already launched the remote PowerShell, remote desktop on my domain controller, and that's my domain controller. And obviously I have been playing around, so I'm gonna close all that to avoid any confusion. So this is the domain az.local. Domain controller in question here is AZLGL-DC02. Obviously this is the DNS, and we have got several forward lookup zones here that we can work with, right? So that's our first thing. Now obviously, because this is Windows Server 2012 R2, we need to install the Windows Framework 5.1 to take the advantage of GIA capabilities, and I have already done that. If you have not, and if you're not sure what version of PowerShell you are running, it's very simple PowerShell command that you can figure it out that what version of PowerShell you are running. And my version is 5. If you're 5, you're good to go. The second prerequisite that we talked about is to enable the PS remoting, right? And I have already done that, but that's the command. And obviously you can install XGIA if you like, but we might not need it for our demo today. So those are the two prerequisites, and once we have met those prerequisites, we can start working on our next requirement. And as I mentioned earlier, the next requirement is to create a capability file, which I have already done that for the DNS. So the first use case that we are going to talk about would be the DNS management. And what we are going to do in this, that we are going to try to make a DNS admin who can do all the tasks, administrative tasks for the DNS, can also restart the DNS services. But he would be limited to restart the DNS services. If he tries to start any other services on your domain controller, he or she would not be able to do that. Second user would be a DNS kind of a viewer only, who would have the read writes on the DNS but would not be able to do anything. So those are our two prerequisites that we have already defined, and based on that we are going to create the two capability files, right? So first we are going to do this in a manual way, then I'm also going to show you that how we can do it for the GIA toolkit helper. So this is our initial file. What we are trying to do here is, first, in the variable for the PowerShell module, we are creating a folder called the GIA role. Not a big deal, that's where this PowerShell has to run, and we are creating a subshell folder underneath that. New item, directory false, right? Then we are also creating a manifestation file for PowerShell, which is GIA role.pst1, which would contain all the requirement of here, the role capabilities file, right? Contains custom GIA role capabilities. That's a file that would be created here. And then we are creating another folder within the module GIA roles called as a role capabilities. which would be the repository for those PSRC file, which is the role capabilities file, right? And again, it's when you read it first time, it looks difficult, but it's, in my viewpoint, once you understand the logic, then it becomes easier. We are defining a variable for the DNS event here, right here. And then we go to the actual task of creating two separate PSRC file, one for DNS viewer and second for DNS admin, right? And the path is already covered here in these variables here. We are using that role capability file path that we created on this here. And if you look carefully, what is the visible command list that we are allowing the user for DNS viewer? We are only saying that you're going to get DNS viewer server get. Get means he can only have the read rights. We all know that. And he can also see the DNS server log, right? Now, because the function that we created here is DNS event, that's the function that we are using here, right? Now, we also are creating a admin role or admin PRC capability file here, to be precise. And here we are letting it use all the commands on DNS server. He also given rights for the restarting the services, and but we are limiting of restart service function, because if it leave it wide open, that means this user could start any services, and you do not want to let him start Active Directory services or anything else, right? So we just want him to confine here to DNS. So unless he types the DNS with the restart service, that is the only restart command that would work. Other than that, it would not work. And once we execute this PowerShell, then it automatically creates the required files. Let's quickly look at it. So the path, as you know, is in the program files, Windows PowerShell, modules, and the GR roles, right? That's what we are using, and it created the role capabilities. We have got both our files here. You have the manifestation file here, the PSD one, and that is what we did with this PowerShell. If you just want to peep into DNS admin file here, you will see the command that you defined here is available, right? And the functions that we have defined here. So this is good to go. Now, so our second task of creating the right capability file is created. Now we're gonna create a configuration file, right? And let me close this. I don't think it's too hard, guys, right? And here is my config. And what we are saying here is, okay. We are saying here, the variable here is grconfig path. We are defining that. The path is program data gr configuration. We're going to look at it. And then the two groups that we are going to use for this purpose, which is the Active Directory groups. One is grdns viewers, another is grdns admin. So we obviously need to have some operators that are the actual user accounts who are a member of these groups. And once we add them into these appropriate groups, they should be able to take the advantage of gr functionality, right? Then we are creating a grconfig path, which is the path that we have defined here on top. And the file that we are creating, the configuration file, is grconfig.psc. I mentioned to you earlier. This is important, folks, here. Restrict the remote server, which limits it, and then you will see here run as a virtual account. That is what I talked earlier with, where you actually do not use the user's actual login IDs, but it would create a temporary virtual ID that would be removed after the PowerShell session is over. And you will see here the role capabilities, the file that we created for DNS viewer and DNS admin, both are being used in this. They are being allowed to connect to this PowerShell, or to be precise, to this GR endpoint. And once we have created this file in the same PowerShell, we are registering this PS configuration, and our GIA endpoint that we are creating here is DNS administration, right? When I ran this PowerShell, obviously it has created the required files, and let's quickly look into program data and GIA configuration, and here is your PSSC file that we talked about, right? We can edit it. This is the transcript directory where all the PowerShell CMDlets are available. Run as a virtual account. We talked about it earlier. The two groups that are being allowed to use and connect to this endpoints are GIA DNS admin, GIA DNS where, and that's pretty much it. So now once I have registered that, if I go to the PowerShell and I say here get PS session config, and either I can see all the PS configuration or I can just say name here DNS administration. Right, so we have the PowerShell version 5.1, the GIA endpoint or configuration registration point is DNS administration, who are allowed here, the two groups here, right? And that's all the configuration part that we have. I can either show you the remote PS session right here, but let's just use in a realistic sense, right? Before I go there, I also want to show you that with these two groups that we have here, and we have a user GIA DNS admin, and obviously we have this guy who should have the member as GIA DNS viewer, right? So we're good to go. One more task that I did for the monitoring perspective, we should not forget that, that's equally important. Let's go here. In the group policy management, because this is a domain controller, I modify the default domain controller policy, and that would allow me to see all PowerShell related activities, right? So we go policies, administrative templates, Windows component, Windows PowerShell, and turn on module logging, right? That's what you need to enable it. And module names, I want to capture everything, and once I have done that, now I should be able to see all the activities in the event logs, right? So I'm all set here. Now let's try to see going from the workstation perspective. So first I'm going to log in as GIA DNS admin, and I'm logged in here. PowerShell is already launched. I can create a remote session now here. Enter PS session. Okay, and where are we connecting to? aglgldc02.az.local. that's our domain controller. And what is our endpoint? GIA endpoint configuration name is DNS administration. Okay, that's all. And you will see that the PS command was changed to now the domain controller. So I'm now doing a remote PS session on aglgdc02. Let's see what commands this guy has rights to run, right? So get command. As we mentioned that because he's a DNS admin, he has all the rights to run all the DNS PowerShell command, besides having the read rights, which is the get command, right? So we'll compare these rights momentarily, and let's see whether we can create a real DNS record here. Okay, So let me go back and make sure I do not have that entry. So AG.local, we are going to create a record, and I'm going to cheat my PowerShell or the command. That's why I don't want to keep that record here, to make it fast. And here is my command. Going back to PowerShell. So what we are saying here is add DNS resource record a record. The name of the record is host24, zone name is az.local, allow update, IP address is this, right? If I execute that, it should be able to create that record because it has a DNS admin rights, right? So if I refresh it here, I should be able to see that record. Right, host24, we just created that, and IP address is right here, right? I mean, you can test all the PowerShell command that was listed earlier, but that's the task that you were looking for. So this particular user has the rights to do all the DNS administrative function, right? Let's exit from here, and let's look at the event logger here as well. You need to go to the application services log, Microsoft, Windows, PowerShell, and operations, right? So PowerShell and operational. And the event ID that we are looking for is 4104 generally, right? Here you go. So as I was mentioning, it has used a virtual ID, not the actual user ID when we executed a remote PowerShell command. I can show you a few other activities that I have been doing in past that would have a different user ID when I was trying to test another solution, right? So let me try to show you that. Here is another example that I was running earlier. You see here the event ID is 4104, execute a remote command, and account is, this is a fake account, virtual temporary ID that I was talking about. So that proves that what we were trying to do. Now let's go back to that system and try to see the viewer activity here, right? So we can do it two different ways. Either I can log off and log back as a DNSWare account, or I can just use the $cred option, right? So we'll see. So folks, I'm logged in here as DNSWare now, and we try to do the remote PS or remote PowerShell session. So we are connected to the domain controller as DNSWare account, and let's see what commands he gets now. And you see here he only has the get command, right? So I think he can get DNS server zone, but that's pretty much it. Or look at the logs. And that he can do. But if we try to restart service, then even if he defines the DNS as a parameter, he should not be able to do that, right? And now if I exit from here and try to go as a DNS admin, then what happens? Correct. So we are now passing the credentials for DNS admin account, and as long as I typed it right. And now we're going to create another session here. And now I'm connected as a DNS admin. So if I try restart service, I need to restart DNS. I can even type name here, hopefully, and DNS. It just worked, right? It didn't give me an error. If I just change it here to, let's say, spooler, it should just fail, correct? And that's what we have shown so far, or what we have seen so far, that we were able to configure a capability file for two different capabilities file, PSRC file, one for DNSWare, one for DNS admin. We were able to create a configuration file, and we were able to register it as a DNS administration. And then we were able to log on as a remote PS session as DNS admin, and we were able to do all the DNS related administrative activities. We were able to restart the DNS services. Then DNSWare was only able to read the information or get the information, was not able to do anything, and also proven that our monitoring works fine, and the 4104 even shows up, which also proves that throughout this remote PS session we were using the virtual temporary account, not the actual AD account, right? And that concludes the first portion of this demo, which was related to DNS management on domain controller, right? So we have not touched the domain controller. We have not allowed the user to log on to domain controller. He is using a virtual ID, and he or she is still able to do the required functions or task as given to him, right? Now with that, we should move into the next part, which would be the Azure Active Directory, oh sorry, not Azure Active Directory, Active Directory administration through Jia. All right, so as far as the Active Directory management through the Jia roles are concerned, it's pretty interesting, but some of the PowerShell command of DNS are not so specific that it could run, and you cannot pass the variable in the simple PowerShell command, so we need to tweak it a little bit. But other than that, I would like to show you that how can you use the toolkit, the Jia toolkit, and I strongly recommend you to download the Jia toolkit 2.0 version, right? So I think I downloaded here, and Jia helper tool, right? So that's the difference. One is Jia toolkit helper and one is Jia helper tool. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. Download it, and I have extracted these files into the PowerShell working directory. So if I go ahead, program files, into the PowerShell modules, and I think I put it here, right? So here is the two different files. This Jia helper tool.ps1 is 2.0 version. This is the older version, which was called as a Jia toolkit helper.ps1, right? So I would strongly recommend you to use obviously the 2.01. This is the Jia help, and let's see what we can do with this. Let me just pause it, so I don't want to waste your time. So I am in that PowerShell virtual the directory here, and from here we can launch the Jia helper tool, right? Excuse me, not the toolkit, Jia helper tool, and we can allow it to run. See here the green Jia helper tool version 2.0. Please keep a note of it. And this would open a GUI interface for you, which is much simpler and easier to use, right? So what we can do here is, first we can define here that the role capability file name or role capability name. So let's say I call it as HELP2, right? And the module name also I put it HELP2. Obviously author is me, so So I have the liberty to put my name, and my company name is Avanade. So I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to create this file. So you see here how easy it was to create a file and as well as a folder inside the PowerShell module help2 and role capabilities. That's a folder underneath the help2, and I was able to create help2 PSRC. If you remember the same thing that we did with the PowerShell on the DNS, now we were able to do this here. This is a empty file. There is no customization here yet. Now what we could do here is we can go to the role capability design and we can start adding commands here. So for an example, I can say here that Active Directory for an example, and I want them to use everything, for an example, read everything, right? I give them the command and I can go ahead and copy and paste it here. So the visible commandlets, right? Okay, and that means I'm only giving him the read writes here, right? I'm creating a help as to which is only, or let me just change it, call this an AD right? And you could go back and do a lot of other fancy thing here, right? You can specifically add all the required commands and parameters here, right? So for an example, if I say create here new user, right, and it would require a few more tweaking here, which I'll show you, but see, so many services, restart service, and I go new AD group for an example. And you see here, if you see on the everything that you are running is actually running back in the PowerShell here too. So it's confirming whether you are doing right step or wrong, right? And I pick up here and I say what parameters I want to use here. So I want to allow the users to use for new AD group. I want to say display name. I want to say same account name. Okay, and I say add to the grid. So now I have added new AD group, same account name, new AD group, display name, right? So we have got two commands here, and you see here down the road it is changing the, you can copy to the clipboard here. If you also have the visible functions, you can add visible functions too, but I'm just showing you very simple way of doing it. And I can come back here on the visible commandlets and copy and paste it here, right? And if I go back, I'm good here, I'm good here, and if I'm ready with all what I'm trying to do, I can go ahead and publish it. So I have already done these configuration endpoint or GA endpoints. If you want, instead of going to PowerShell, if you want to unregister them, that's also very simple here. So you're not happy with something, you can go ahead and unregister it as well. Right now we're going to register this just for a demonstration purposes. So I need to map a particular user or a group here. My domain name is active AZ, and I'm going to use here what's the security group I should use? I think I had non-admin group somewhere right here. And what role we are capability file we are going to use, we already defined it here, ad-read, right? So we just go here and define ad-read. this group should be present, otherwise it's going to give you the default permissions, right, if it's not resolvable. And if I create, what's the endpoint name? Let's call it as Gia AD read, right? It's going to create that configuration file. This is all GUI, right? So you don't have to go in all that. This is easy. So if you can say create here, it should create and register your configuration. And if I have done that here, right, it's registering right now and session is done. So if I go here and launch PowerShell and I say get, basically you should be able to see it there, but let me show you here to PS. So what we created here was DNS administration, Gia demo 2. Here you go, right? This is just what we created, and you are ready, good to go ahead and start using it. You will also see that this all automatically shows up here, and if I want to unregister it here, I can just unregister it here too. So that makes our life a little easier. But what I have also done here, let me just close it and reopen a file so that I can explain you. So I'm opening it again, and this time, instead of creating a new file, I'm going to browse the file that I did it a few minutes back, right? And you will see here, what we did here is that we did a little bit of improvisation here. So what we are allowing this user to do here is that he can modify the user, because if you give the user the set AD user command, that could do a lot of stuff, and that could be very scary. So we don't want the user to do everything possible. We want to limit him, this Gia operator, to be able to run the AD user command, but the parameter is that we're going to limit him to modify the title only, the title attribute, and it could be only either manager or engineer, right? That's all he can do. Anything besides that, he cannot execute any set AD user command. So that's where you see the power of Gia, and you can customize it, right? And second thing that we are allowing this user to do is we are saying, hey, you can add members to the group, but the parameter is that you can only modify the test group, nothing beyond that. You cannot do anything else here. He can enable account or he can disable account. He can also remove this account, right? And that's what we did with this simple change here, right? I also have created a function behind, but I'm not using it for password because it needs strings needs to be converted. I have a function created in another PSM1 file, but that's pretty much it. And you define what role you want, all these details. You go here and you do the same thing that I did, and I already published it as Gia Help Desk, right? So if you see here, Gia Help Desk is already here, and if I go back here, role capabilities, and I say existing role capability Help Desk, this is what here. So in order to do what I did, you need to run all these commands. You have to add from here, right? Pretty much it. So you could do that, and once you do that, you go here and define your AD group that you want to use for this purpose, define your endpoint name. Here you go, and we are all done, right? So what we have here is, in this particular one, that the group that we are using for this particular help desk is the same group that we are using, Gia non-administrator group, and the role capability file is help desk, which is what I showed you. And this user should be able to do following. So let's try and test it, right? So closing here, going back to the PowerShell, and then I would just run it from here, right? So $cred and I'm going to use the same account that I was using earlier, GR DNS admin, and why I'll show you in a second. So if you look here, this is the group that we are using for this particular endpoint, and I have added this account so we can test with this account, right? Okay. And then we need to go into the all right, so if I say here get command, so add AD group member, we have given him that rights, get and with the parameters, so he cannot do to everybody. He can enable account, he can disable account, right? And he can also set AD user, that we have limited set AD user to the title, correct? And let's see what he can do, right? So let's see if we can use the set AD user identity. Let's pick up a user here. So I'm hoping that if I run this command, this should work fine. Okay, so it has run fine. AV01 test. I should have a title on this guy is now as engineer, right? We did that. Let's say we can change it to manager now, because those are the two validation sets that we can run. So I can try to change this to a manager. And that has gone fine. So if I go AV01 test, manager, but let's try one more thing. So folks, if you see here, I try to change the title to director, and I'm not able to do that because the only two titles that allowed in the PowerShell was engineers and manager, and that's all I can do. If I try to modify any other attribute, I would not be able to do that. By the way, if I try to disable AD account, I should be able to do that because I have that right. So I ran the command disable, and he should have the rights. He had the right, and he should have disabled AV01. If I refresh it, AV01 is disabled, right? So he can do everything that we want him to do, but nothing beyond that, right? So if I say instead of disable now, I enable that account, it should be able to enable that account, right? So the whole, I think you guys got at the point what I'm trying to say here. And here you go. The same way you can modify the group membership, but it has to be a member of so if I say add AD group member, right, and we are using test group, I should be able to add this user to that group, test group, right? And I was able to do that. So if I go back here on AV01, he is a member of test group. So it does that, but I cannot do anything beyond that. And that's the premise of today's demonstration. And I hope it helps you, friends. And let me know if you have any other question. I have found that it was difficult for me even to get all the relevant information. It took me a while to get around it because all the information that is on the network internet is not good enough to get this thing straightforward, right? So hopefully this was helpful. Thank you again. Have a blessed day. Bye bye.